Hey guys, tonight we peel back the rich velvet curtains of Tudor history, not to gaze upon the familiar grandeur of Henry VIII or the golden age of Elizabeth I, but to enter a far more somber, almost forgotten chamber. Imagine yourself treading softly through the shadowy corridors of Greenwich Palace in the mid-16th century. You're drawn not by sounds of revelry or statecraft, but by a heavy silence, an atmosphere thick with unspoken anxieties. You approach a royal bedchamber, and even before you enter, a faint, unsettlingly sweet and sickly odor might touch your senses, a hint of the profound decay that festers within. For in this room, a young king once hailed as England's most precious jewel is enduring an end so horrific, his young body so relentlessly besieged by a malady that seems to consume him from within, that it stands as a cruel parody of his divine right. He's a monarch imprisoned by his own disintegrating flesh, a potent symbol of how even absolute power ultimately bows to the frailties of the human form. Tonight our journey takes us deep into the final agonizing months of King Edward VI, the boy who inherited the turbulent, magnificent, and often brutal legacy of his father, Henry VIII. We will explore the horrific death of this young monarch, a story often overshadowed by the more flamboyant reigns that flanked his own, yet one that is filled with its own unique brand of gory history, profound medical hardship, and a tragic testament to human endurance in the face of unimaginable suffering. This isn't a tale of glorious battles or political triumphs. It's an intimate, unflinching look at the physical unmaking of a king and the dark, desperate political machinations that swirled around his deathbed. The reality check for tonight. The demise of Edward VI was not a peaceful fading away, as one might wish for a young ruler. It was a protracted, agonizing, and physically repulsive process, one that contemporary accounts, even when couched in respectful language, cannot entirely disguise. The details of his illness, the grotesque symptoms that ravaged his youth, and the desperate, often harmful, medical interventions of the time paint a picture that will test your modern sensibilities. You might think you know the broad strokes of Tudor history, but the intimate horror of this boy king's end, the slow creeping siege upon his body, is a chapter rarely explored in all its grim, nauseating detail. But here, we don't shy away from the uncomfortable truths that history often tries to sanitize. So, before you get comfortable, before we step fully into that sick room where a kingdom's hopes were visibly putrefying alongside its king, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, do drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always a profound experience to connect with our global community of those who find a strange solace in exploring the most challenging corners of the past. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We are about to uncover the tragic and disturbing story of Edward VI's final days. We will examine the shocking secrets of his illness, the desperate political gamble that his impending death precipitated, and the chilling truth behind why England might just have dodged a bullet when this most precious jewel, already showing signs of a disturbing inner nature, was claimed by a horrific early death. Prepare for a tale of royal decay that is as unsettling as it is historically significant. To truly comprehend the tragic arc of Edward VI's life and the horror of his early demise, you must first transport yourself back to a moment of immense, almost hysterical joy and relief within the Tudor court, October the 12th, 1537. After nearly 3 decades on the throne, after 2 annulled marriages, the execution of 1 queen, and a seismic religious schism that had torn England from the fabric of Catholic Europe, King Henry VIII, at the age of 46, finally got what he had so desperately, so obsessively craved: a legitimate male heir. You are there amidst the celebrations at Hampton Court Palace. As the news rings out, Queen Jane Seymour has given birth to a healthy baby boy, Prince Edward. The relief is palpable, not just for Henry, but for the entire kingdom, or at least for those invested in the stability of the Tudor dynasty. For years, the lack of a male heir had cast a long, anxious shadow over England, raising the specter of disputed succession and a potential return to the bloody dynastic conflicts of the Wars of the Roses, which were still a relatively recent and traumatic memory. Henry had moved heaven and earth, or rather, defied the Pope and shattered the English Church in his quest for a son. And now, at last, his prayers, his machinations, his ruthlessness had seemingly paid off. You can almost hear the cannons firing in salute, the Te Deums being sung in churches across the land, a wave of collective exhale after years of dynastic tension. Contemporary chroniclers, their quills no doubt eager to flatter the king and celebrate the arrival of this long-awaited prince, describe the infant Edward in the most glowing, almost reverential terms. He is hailed by some as the most beautiful boy ever seen, a perfect child, a living symbol of God's favor upon Henry's reign and his controversial religious settlement. Henry himself, a man not known for understatement or emotional restraint, is said to have been ecstatic, his joy unbridled. He famously and repeatedly referred to his infant son as this whole realm's most precious jewel. You can imagine the aging, increasingly corpulent king, his own health already beginning its slow, ominous decline from that fateful jousting accident the previous year, gazing upon his infant son with a mixture of fierce pride, possessive love, and perhaps a desperate, almost fearful hope that this tiny child would secure everything he had fought, schemed, and killed for. The christening, held just days later, is a magnificent affair, a display of Tudor pomp and power designed to showcase the security and undisputed legitimacy of the succession to all of Europe. Yet even in this moment of apparent dynastic triumph, a dark shadow falls, a medical hardship that would profoundly shape Edward's earliest years, and, some might argue, his entire life. Just 12 days after giving birth to this precious jewel, Queen Jane Seymour, the third of Henry's 6 wives, and the only one to provide him with a living, legitimate son, dies. The cause, most historians agree, was puerperal fever, childbed fever, a common and often fatal postpartum infection in an era utterly ignorant of germ theory and reliant on primitive, often unhygienic, midwifery practices. It's a devastating blow. Henry, who had finally found a queen who gave him what he most desired, is reportedly heartbroken, even genuinely grief-stricken. And for young Edward, it means he will never know his mother's face, never experience her direct care, her affection, her influence. One quirky, or rather deeply poignant detail often noted by historians is that Henry VIII, despite his many subsequent marital entanglements and his reputation for discarding wives, chose to be buried beside Jane Seymour at Windsor Castle. It's perhaps a testament to his enduring regard for the woman who had fulfilled his most cherished, most desperate dynastic wish. The birth of Edward VI was a moment of immense national hope, the culmination of a king's relentless obsession, He was, from his very first breath, a child of extraordinary privilege and crushing expectation, a jewel carefully guarded, but also one born into a world already touched by loss and the long, heavy shadow of his father's complex and increasingly troubled reign. Prince Edward, now motherless almost from birth, England's priceless male heir, did not experience the bustling, somewhat public upbringing common to many royal children of previous eras. Instead, his earliest years, as you observe, were characterized by an extraordinary degree of carefully managed isolation and an almost fanatical, bordering on obsessive concern for his physical well-being. This was all orchestrated by his aging, increasingly health-conscious, or perhaps health-paranoid, father, King Henry VIII, a man who, having finally obtained his precious jewel, was terrified of losing him to the myriad diseases that regularly culled the infant and child populations of 16th century Europe. This shielded, almost hermetically sealed existence was designed to protect him, but it may also have inadvertently sowed some of the seeds for the shocking secrets of his later, rather detached, and sometimes unsettlingly cold personality. Following the tragic death of Queen Jane Seymour, the infant Edward was immediately enveloped in a cocoon of care, a meticulously controlled environment. He was placed under the principal charge of a trusted governess, Lady Margaret Bryan, who had previously overseen the households of Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and thus had experience in navigating the complexities of royal nurseries. Lady Bryan's surviving letters offer rare, invaluable glimpses into Edward's early life. While Henry VIII undoubtedly doted on his son from a distance, his physical presence was notably scarce during Edward's first few years. The king, acutely aware of the fragility of young life, and perhaps haunted by his own struggles to produce a healthy male heir, was terrified of exposing Edward to any potential infection. This was a very real medical hardship of the age. The constant threat of diseases like sweating sickness, measles, or smallpox, for which there were no cures. You can imagine the king's orders. The prince was to be guarded like the crown jewels themselves. Edward's household became a fortress of preventative hygiene, at least according to the best understanding of Tudor medicine. Access to the young prince was incredibly restricted. Only the highest echelons of the nobility and trusted servants were permitted into his presence, and even they often had to undergo elaborate rituals of purification, or at least scrutiny. No one of rank lower than a knight was typically allowed near him. Visitors, on the rare occasions they were admitted, were expected to show extreme reverence, often kissing the infant's hand. His personal servants, his wet nurses, his rockers, all were chosen with extreme care and were under strict orders to avoid any contact with London or other crowded areas where disease might be prevalent. You can picture this almost sterile bubble, a world where every breath Edward took, every spoonful of food he consumed, was a matter of intense state concern and meticulous oversight. Lady Bryan's early reports, thankfully, describe him as a very cheerful, healthy, and energetic child, apparently thriving physically within this carefully curated, if somewhat unnaturally isolated, environment. His closest companions were few and carefully selected. The script you studied earlier mentioned the young sons of the Duke of Suffolk, Henry and Charles Brandon, his cousins, and tragically, both fated to die young from the sweating sickness during Edward's reign, a loss that deeply affected him, and an Irish boy, Barnaby Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick, in particular, was to become Edward's most cherished friend and confidant throughout his short life. one of the very few individuals with whom the young king seems to have formed a genuine, lasting emotional connection. For a time, his two half-sisters, the much older Mary and the slightly older Elizabeth, also resided in the same household or nearby, particularly at Hunsdon House in Hertfordshire. These periods of shared nursery life, before religious and political differences would later drive deep wedges between them, were perhaps rare oases of something resembling normal familial affection and interaction in Edward's otherwise extraordinarily pressured and isolated upbringing. The scholarly debate often considers the long-term psychological impact of this early isolation and the intense focus on his role as heir. Did it foster a sense of detachment, an inability to empathize with the common populace, or perhaps a precocious, even unnerving seriousness? The shocking secret is that this most precious jewel was being polished in a very confined, very specific, and perhaps emotionally sterile setting. Though King Henry VIII was a physically distant presence for much of Prince Edward's infancy and early childhood, his influence, his towering persona, and his very specific, often obsessive expectations cast an inescapable and deeply formative shadow over the young heir. Henry was not merely a father in the conventional sense. He was a colossal, almost deified figure in Edward's carefully constructed world. The Majesty, Henry the Great, the king who had bent England to his will, and Henry in turn harbored a powerful, almost unnerving desire for his son, not just to succeed him, but to be him, or rather, to be an idealized continuation of his own flawed and complex legacy. You, the observer, can see how this strange, intense, and somewhat asymmetrical psychological dynamic would be a crucial factor in shaping the boy who would become king, potentially contributing to some of the more twisted or deranged aspects of his character, later noted by contemporaries and historians. One of the most peculiar, almost gory in its psychological implications, manifestations of Henry's desire to mold his son in his own image, was his reported insistence, as Edward grew from toddler to young boy, around age 6, when he was brought more formally into his father's sphere for education, on having the prince's apartments and even his wardrobe meticulously designed as miniature replicas of his own. Imagine young Edward, a child of 6 or 7, dressed not in the comfortable, practical clothes of boyhood, but in scaled-down versions of his father's elaborate, often heavy and restrictive, Tudor court attire. The doublets, the hose, the jeweled collars. His private rooms are said to have been redecorated to mirror the king's own, perhaps even with similar tapestries or furnishings. You can almost feel the suffocating weight of this enforced mimicry. This wasn't simply about providing a princely environment suitable for an heir. It was a deliberate, almost obsessive attempt to program the son to ensure that Edward would, quite literally, walk in Henry's footsteps, think Henry's thoughts, become Henry's clone. The medical hardship here is the subtle but profound psychological pressure, the constant, unspoken demand to live up to an impossible, larger-than-life paternal image. This desire for Edward to be a miniature Henry extended beyond mere appearances. The famous portrait of Edward painted by Hans Holbein the Younger, when the prince was just 18 months old, is a testament to this. The infant, already depicted with a certain regal gravity, is accompanied by a Latin inscription. This inscription, a direct address to the viewer and implicitly to the child himself, advises him to strive to resemble thy father, imitare bo patrum, emulate the father, and to surpass the great deeds of antiquity. This message, be like Henry, nay, be greater than Henry, was thus etched into Edward's public and private identity from his earliest, most impressionable moments. You try to fathom the burden on such a young child, to be constantly reminded of this colossal expectation, and in certain chilling ways, as the script notes you provided earlier suggest, Henry's wish did seem to come true, though perhaps not in the entirely positive manner he might have envisioned. Edward, as he matured, did indeed develop a strong will, a fierce determination, and a profound conviction in his own religious and political righteousness, qualities that mirrored his father's. However, he also seemed to inherit, or perhaps develop through his unique upbringing, a certain coldness, a detachment from the suffering of others, and a potential for ruthlessness that alarmed some contemporaries. The scholarly debate often explores this complex inheritance. Did Edward internalize Henry's virtues, such as his intellect and decisiveness, or his vices, his tyranny, his paranoia, his cruelty? Or was it an unfortunate fusion of both? The shocking secret is that in Henry VIII's desperate, almost pathological need for a son to embody and continue his legacy, he may have unwittingly created an heir who mirrored not only his strength, but also his most dangerous and destructive tendencies, all amplified by an upbringing of intense religious indoctrination and emotional isolation. The father's shadow was a powerful and potentially very dark inheritance. The colossal, indomitable figure of King Henry VIII, whose reign had redefined England and whose personal desires had cast such a long shadow over his son's young life, finally succumbs to his grotesque catalogue of ailments on that fateful January day in 1547. He was 55, a broken giant, and in that instant, his most precious jewel, his only legitimate son, Edward, a boy of just 9 years and 3 months, is proclaimed King Edward VI of England and Ireland, supreme head of the Church of England. Imagine the scene, if you can. The news, initially kept a closely guarded secret for a few days, as per custom to ensure an orderly transition, is finally broken to the young prince, then residing at Hertford Castle with his half-sister Elizabeth. Contemporary accounts, like that of Edward's tutor, Dr. Richard Cox, describe both children weeping bitterly, clinging to each other in shared grief, upon learning of their formidable father's death. For Edward, despite Henry's physical distance for much of his early life, the king was more than just a parent. He was Henry the Great, an almost mythical figure, the sun around which his entire young existence had revolved, the human endurance of a child of 9, facing not only profound personal loss, but also the sudden, overwhelming weight of a kingdom, is difficult for us to truly comprehend. But the elaborate rituals of Tudor grief and the solemnities of a royal funeral, which we explored in Henry's own grotesque end, could not long delay the urgent, ruthless realities of power politics. Edward VI was king, yes, but he was a child. A regency was not just a formality, it was an absolute necessity. Henry VIII, in his typically autocratic fashion, had attempted to control events even from beyond the grave. His will had stipulated that England should be governed during Edward's minority by a council of regency, comprising 16 named executors, all of equal authority. a carefully constructed balance designed to prevent any single individual or faction from seizing undue power. This council included prominent nobles and experienced administrators, both religious conservatives and reformers. You can almost hear Henry in his final lucid moments, believing he had secured a stable transition for his son. However, this was Tudor England, an arena where ambition, religious fervor, and personal rivalries were potent, often explosive forces. The shocking secret is just how quickly Henry's meticulously crafted plan for collective regency unraveled, almost before his massive, decaying corpse had even begun its infamous journey to Windsor. You are there, an unseen observer in the tense, closed-door meetings of the Privy Council in the days immediately following Henry's death. The air is thick with intrigue, whispered negotiations, and the barely concealed jostling for position. Within a mere 3 days, Henry's will was effectively overturned. The man who emerged triumphant from this initial, swift power struggle was Edward's maternal uncle, Edward Seymour, then Earl of Hertford, a man of considerable ambition, a staunch Protestant reformer, and, crucially, the new king's closest adult male relative. Through a combination of skillful political maneuvering, promises, perhaps some bribery, and the argument that a single, strong hand was needed to guide the realm during the king's minority, Seymour persuaded or pressured the other executors to grant him preeminence. He was elevated to the dukedom of Somerset, and, most importantly, appointed Lord Protector of the realm and Governor of the king's person. He became, in effect, the sole regent, the de facto ruler of England. The carefully constructed collective regency, Henry VIII's final attempt to control his kingdom, had lasted less than a week. The medical hardship of Henry's will being so swiftly disregarded is a testament to the raw power dynamics at play. The boy king, Edward VI, now sat on a turbulent throne, his reign beginning not with the stability his father had craved, but with a decisive, and some would say ominous, concentration of power in the hands of his ambitious uncle. As the Duke of Somerset, Lord Protector of England, begins to wield his considerable power, shaping policy and crushing dissent in the name of his 9-year-old nephew, King Edward VI. Your attention, as a keen observer of this historical drama, naturally turns to the boy king himself. How is this most precious jewel, now the titular monarch of a powerful and religiously divided nation, reacting to the tumultuous events unfolding around him? Is he a frightened child, a bewildered pawn, or is something else beginning to stir within that young, heavily indoctrinated mind? The shocking secret that starts to seep out from contemporary accounts, and most chillingly from Edward's own dispassionate writings, is not that of a sensitive, grieving boy, but of a precocious, remarkably intelligent, and often unnervingly cold and detached young individual. These seeds of cruelty, as the script notes you provided earlier suggest, may indeed have been present, or at least were being carefully, if unintentionally, nurtured by his environment. One of the starkest, most frequently cited examples of this unnerving detachment concerns the dramatic downfall and execution of Edward's other uncle, Thomas Seymour, Baron Sudeley. Thomas was the younger, more flamboyant, and perhaps even more recklessly ambitious brother of the Lord Protector Somerset. Shortly after Henry VIII's death, Thomas Seymour had caused a scandal by secretly marrying Catherine Parr, Henry's widow and Edward's stepmother, an act of astounding audacity. Not content with this, he then began to cultivate a relationship with the young King Edward, secretly supplying him with pocket money and attempting to turn the boy against his brother, Somerset, whispering insinuations about the protector's growing power. His ambitions knew no bounds. There were even rumors he had designs on marrying Princess Elizabeth. His plotting, however, was clumsy and ultimately self-destructive. In January 1549, Thomas Seymour was arrested, accused of treason for allegedly plotting to kidnap King Edward, marry Elizabeth, and overthrow his brother. One particularly damning incident involved him being caught trying to break into Edward's bedchamber at Whitehall Palace at night, during which he shot and killed the king's beloved pet spaniel when it barked an alarm. The Lord Protector Somerset, faced with such blatant treason from his own flesh and blood, acted with ruthless decisiveness. Thomas Seymour was condemned by an act of attainder, a legal process bypassing a full trial, often used for high treason, and beheaded on Tower Hill in March 1549. This was a major court scandal, a brutal act of fratricide that sent shockwaves through the Tudor establishment. You would expect any child, let alone one of 11 years, Edward's age at the time, to be profoundly affected by the violent death of such a close relative, an uncle who had, however manipulatively, shown him some attention. Yet King Edward VI's entry in his personal chronicle regarding this event is a masterpiece of chilling brevity and emotional detachment. He records in his neat, scholarly hand, "The Lord Sudeley, Admiral of England, was condemned to death and died in March, the 20th day. No sorrow, no shock, no reflection. Just a cold, hard fact. The medical hardship here is not physical, but a potential indicator of a deeply suppressed or absent emotional capacity, a coldness that many found deeply unsettling in one so young. This apparent lack of empathy, or at least its conspicuous absence in his writings, is also evident later that same year in his reaction to the widespread popular rebellions that convulsed England during the summer of 1549. We will delve into these uprisings in more detail, but for now, it is Edward's recorded response that offers another glimpse into his developing character. These were major insurrections, primarily in Norfolk, Kett's Rebellion, and the West Country, the Prayer Book Rebellion, fueled by fierce opposition to Somerset's radical religious changes, particularly the imposition of the New English Book of Common Prayer, and severe economic hardship. Thousands of ordinary people participated, and their suppression by royal forces, often involving foreign mercenaries, was notoriously brutal. Edward, in his chronicle, describes these events with a keen interest in the military details, the troop movements, the casualty figures. But, as the script notes you provided highlight, he shows little to no understanding of the rebels' grievances, their desperation, or their suffering. Instead, he seems to express a grim satisfaction, even a thrill, at the accounts of battles and, most disturbingly, at the news that 900 rebels were massacred by forces under the command of John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, after one engagement. This is not the voice of a compassionate boy king. It is the voice of a detached, perhaps even callous, student of power and military force. The scholarly debate continues. Was this innate coldness a product of his isolated and highly pressured upbringing, or the result of his intense Protestant indoctrination, which often framed religious opponents as enemies of God deserving of harsh punishment? Whatever the cause, the shocking secret emerging is that England's young king was developing a worldview alarmingly devoid of common human sympathy, a trait that, had he lived longer, might have made him a truly terrifying ruler. The Duke of Somerset's tenure as Lord Protector though initially marked by a decisive consolidation of power and a zealous pursuit of Protestant religious reform, was not destined to last. His rule, as you, the observer, witness in the unfolding drama of King Edward VI's early reign, became increasingly characterized by arrogance, financial mismanagement, and a growing list of powerful enemies within the Privy Council. The shocking secret of Tudor politics was its utter ruthlessness, and Somerset, for all his authority, was about to receive a brutal lesson in its application, a lesson that his young nephew, the king, would undoubtedly absorb with keen, if chillingly detached interest. Somerset, as Edward Seymour, had always been an ambitious man. His elevation to the protectorate after Henry VIII's death had been swift and skillfully managed. However, power, especially in the volatile religious and political climate of mid-16th century England, is a difficult beast to master. Somerset's problems were manifold. His expensive and largely inconclusive wars in Scotland, aimed at forcing a marriage between young Edward and Mary, Queen of Scots, the rough wooing, drained the already depleted royal treasury. His continuation of Henry VIII's policy of debasing the coinage to fund these wars led to rampant inflation and economic hardship for ordinary people. The medical hardship for the realm was a growing social and economic sickness. Furthermore, his radical Protestant religious reforms, particularly the imposition of the 1549 Book of Common Prayer, while welcomed by zealous reformers, deeply alienated conservative Catholic-leaning regions of the country, directly contributing to the widespread and bloody rebellions of that summer. While Somerset suppressed these rebellions with eventual, if sometimes delayed, military force, his handling of the crises was criticized by many on the Privy Council. Some felt he had been too slow to react, too hesitant, perhaps even too lenient in his initial responses, though the final suppressions were anything but. Others, particularly those with more conservative religious views, or those who simply envied his power, saw an opportunity. His execution of his own brother Thomas Seymour in March 1549, while removing a direct rival, had also, as the script notes highlighted, damaged Somerset's moral standing and made him appear tyrannical and hypocritical. He was increasingly isolated, his high-handed, almost regal demeanor grating on his fellow counselors. You can almost feel the resentment simmering beneath the surface of courtly deference. The prime architect of Somerset's downfall was the shrewd and equally ambitious John Dudley, then Earl of Warwick, soon to be Duke of Northumberland. Dudley was a seasoned military commander and a cunning politician. He began to quietly build a coalition of disaffected nobles and councillors, exploiting their grievances against Somerset's rule. By October 1549, the tide had turned. The Privy Council, now largely united against the Protector, began to openly challenge his authority. Somerset, panicking, attempted to rally popular support in London, and in a desperate and ill-judged move, effectively took the young King Edward VI with him, as he retreated from Hampton Court to the greater security, or so he thought, of Windsor Castle. This act, which essentially made the king a pawn, or even a hostage in Somerset's power struggle, was the final straw for many. It was seen as an affront to the king's dignity and a dangerous escalation. The council in London formally accused Somerset of misgoverning the realm, of endangering the king, and of exceeding his authority. His support crumbled. He was arrested in October of 1549 and stripped of his offices. For a time, it seemed he might escape with his life. After a period of imprisonment in the Tower, he was eventually released and even readmitted to the Privy Council in 1550, a quirky or perhaps calculated display of magnanimity by Dudley, who was now the dominant figure. However, this was merely a temporary reprieve. The rivalry between Somerset and Northumberland continued to simmer. In late 1551, Somerset was arrested again, this time on more dubious, likely fabricated charges of plotting to raise an insurrection and assassinate Northumberland and other councillors. The gory history of Tudor politics was about to claim another high-profile victim. Despite a spirited defense and considerable public sympathy, many Londoners reportedly wept at his execution. Somerset was condemned for felony and beheaded on Tower Hill on January the 22nd, 1552. King Edward VI, now a more mature 14-year-old, recorded his uncle's death in his chronicle with that same unnerving, factual brevity. The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off upon Tower Hill between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. The shocking secret for Edward was another brutal lesson in the unforgiving nature of power. Even the closest familial ties, even the highest office, offered no true security. The cold hand of Tudor justice could fall on anyone. The execution of his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, in January 1552, marks a subtle but significant turning point in the reign of the young King Edward VI. He is now 14, an age when royal heirs in the 16th century were beginning to be considered capable of more direct involvement in governance, even if still formally in their minority. With Somerset gone and John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, now the undisputed preeminent figure on the Privy Council, you, the observer, might expect Edward to remain a pliant figurehead, but instead, a shocking secret, or perhaps a natural, if accelerated, maturation, begins to reveal itself. Edward starts to assert his own personality, his own intellect, and his own increasingly firm convictions upon the affairs of state. The boy king is, in some respects, truly becoming a king, a Henry VIII in the making, as historian Dearmaid McCulloch so chillingly observed. While Northumberland was far too astute a politician to adopt the overtly autocratic title of Lord Protector that had contributed to Somerset's downfall, preferring to rule through his skilled manipulation and dominance of the Privy Council. He also recognized the importance of keeping the young, intelligent king engaged and ostensibly involved. Edward's education had been rigorous and intensely focused on preparing him for kingship. He was fluent in Latin, Greek, and French, well versed in theology of a strongly Protestant bent, and possessed a keen, analytical mind. You can imagine him, no longer a child easily dismissed, attending Privy Council meetings with increasing frequency, listening intently to debates, and, crucially, beginning to articulate his own views with a surprising, and for some counselors, perhaps unnerving, clarity and forcefulness. His personal chronicle, which he kept meticulously, provides invaluable insights into his developing mind. While his earlier entries are often simple records of events, his later writings show a growing grasp of complex political, economic, and religious issues. He expresses strong opinions, particularly on matters of religious doctrine and church governance, consistently championing the most radical forms of Protestant reform. The human endurance he now displays is that of a young man grappling with immense responsibilities, determined to leave his own mark on his kingdom. There are concrete examples of Edward's burgeoning assertiveness. The script notes you provided earlier highlighted one such instance, his personal intervention in the consecration oath of John Hooper, the reformist bishop of Gloucester, when Hooper, a man of very strict Protestant principles, objected to certain phrases in the traditional oath that he considered popish, referring to saints and evangelists. It was the young king himself who reportedly took a pen and decisively struck out the offending words. This was not the act of a puppet. It was the assertion of a monarch with a clear theological vision and the will to enforce it, even against established churchmen. The medical hardship for those who might wish to oppose his religious zeal was the dawning realization that this boy was not to be trifled with. The famous portrait of Edward VI by the artist Guillaume Scroats, likely painted around 1550 to 1551, when he was 13 or 14, captures this transition. He stands confidently, his gaze direct and somewhat haughty, his hand resting possessively on a dagger at his belt. This is no longer the cherubic prince of Holbein's earlier depictions. This is a young man beginning to embody the authority and majesty of his office. The scholarly debate often considers the extent to which this newfound assertiveness was genuinely Edward's own, versus how much it might have been subtly encouraged or even manipulated by Northumberland, who perhaps saw an advantage in ruling alongside a king who appeared to be making his own decisions, thereby lending greater legitimacy to Northumberland's own policies. One quirky detail from Edward's chronicle is his keen interest in, and often sharp criticism of, the financial mismanagement and corruption he perceived among some officials. He expresses a desire for efficiency, for order, for a well-run kingdom, themes that would resonate with his later, more ambitious plans for reform. The shocking secret for the older, more experienced politicians on his council might have been the dawning awareness that this young king, once a malleable child, was rapidly developing into a formidable, intelligent, and potentially very autocratic ruler in his own right, a true son of Henry VIII in more ways than just blood. The question looming was whether his fragile health would allow him to reach his full and perhaps terrifying potential. The summer of 1552 sees King Edward VI, now nearly 15 years old and increasingly confident in his royal role, embark on his first significant royal progress. This isn't merely a ceremonial tour. It's an opportunity for the young monarch to inspect his kingdom, to be seen by his people, and more importantly from his perspective, to engage directly in the practicalities of governance and to assess the state of his realm, particularly its defenses and finances. As you, the observer, accompany this royal entourage through the southern and western counties of England, a shocking secret about Edward's character and vision is further illuminated. He is not just a devout Protestant, but a keen, almost cold-blooded modernizer, with a passion for efficiency, central control, and rational planning that seems remarkably ahead of his time, yet also carries a hint of his father's autocratic tendencies. Imagine the scene. The royal party, a considerable train of courtiers, officials, guards, and servants, moves through the English countryside. The human endurance of such travel in the 16th century, even for a king, was significant. Long days on horseback or in springless carriages, over often poorly maintained roads, with elaborate logistical arrangements, required for accommodation and provisioning at each stop. For Edward, however, this is more than a scenic tour. It's a working expedition. His personal chronicle, kept during this progress, reveals his sharp intellect and his intense focus on matters of state. The script notes you provided earlier highlighted his deep concern with the kingdom's dire financial situation, a legacy of Henry VIII's extravagances and Somerset's expensive wars. You see him, a teenager, meticulously examining accounts, expressing distress at the level of debt and perceived incompetence or corruption amongst officials, and actively seeking ways to restore the national treasury. This isn't the behavior of a disinterested boy king. It's the mark of a ruler already deeply immersed in the complexities of fiscal policy. He is recorded as being particularly anxious about the debasement of the currency and keen to implement reforms to improve its value. His interest in military matters, particularly naval and coastal defenses, is also striking. At Portsmouth, he inspects his father's naval dockyards and fortifications with what is described as a cold, expert eye. You can picture him, a young man who has studied military theory, critically assessing the state of these defenses. He is enthusiastic about the harbor's potential, but scathing about the poor construction and outdated design of some of the existing forts, ordering their immediate rebuilding and modernization. This passion for strong, efficient defenses and a powerful navy would have resonated with Henry VIII's own focus on sea power. The medical hardship here is perhaps the grueling pace he set for himself and his retinue, driven by this relentless desire to inspect, assess, and improve. Edward's vision, as it emerges through his actions and writings during this progress, is one of a centralized, efficient, and strongly Protestant England. He believes in planning, in order, in a government that can effectively manage its resources and defend its borders. One quirky detail, as the script notes mention, is a letter he sends to his friend Barnaby Fitzpatrick during this trip, expressing a certain smugness about England's virtues compared to neighboring countries, and a somewhat isolationist view. He is interested in consolidating and protecting his own realm, not in foreign adventures or ravaging the territories of friends or neighbors. This could be seen as youthful idealism, or perhaps an early sign of a more insular, intensely nationalistic form of kingship. The scholarly debate considers whether this modernizing, centralizing impulse was entirely his own, or heavily influenced by his pragmatic chief minister, Northumberland. It was likely a combination, but the shocking secret revealed by this royal progress is the sheer precocity and steely determination of this young king. He was no mere puppet. He had a clear, if somewhat austere and uncompromising vision for his kingdom, a vision he was increasingly determined to implement. The tragedy, as we are about to see, is that his own body and the fragile state of 16th century medicine would not allow him the time to fully realize it, just as King Edward VI is beginning to truly step into his royal authority, demonstrating a keen intellect and a firm will during his royal progress in the summer of 1552. The shadow of ill health, a harbinger of his horrific death, begins to fall. The shocking secret that underpins much of his final year is that his young body, despite its initial promise of Tudor vitality, possessed a tragically compromised immune system, a vulnerability that would leave him defenseless against the final, devastating onslaught of disease. The first significant blow to his health, as the script notes you provided earlier indicated, occurred in April 1552, shortly before his summer progress. Edward, then 14, contracted measles. Measles in the 16th century, as you know, was a common but potentially serious childhood illness, far more dangerous than it is today in vaccinated populations. While Edward did recover from the acute phase of the disease, Contemporary accounts and later medical interpretations suggest that this bout of measles had a devastating, lasting impact. It effectively destroyed his immune system, or at least severely weakened his body's natural defenses. You can imagine the anxiety at court, the medical hardship of nursing a young king through such an illness, with the limited remedies available, perhaps just bed rest, cooling drinks, and prayers. There was no understanding of virology, no antiviral treatments. This weakening of his shield came at a time when England was still reeling from, or at least acutely aware of, other epidemic diseases. The dreaded sweating sickness, Tudor, a mysterious and terrifyingly swift killer, had swept through England in several devastating outbreaks, most recently in 1551. This illness, as the script notes mention, had tragically claimed the lives of two of Edward's closest childhood friends and cousins, Henry and Charles Brandon, the young Dukes of Suffolk. You can try to picture the impact of such a loss on the young king, not just the personal grief, but perhaps also a heightened awareness of his own mortality, a sense of lurking danger from unseen pestilence. The scholarly debate continues on the exact nature of the sweating sickness. Was it a form of influenza, hantavirus, or something else entirely? But its lethality was undeniable. So, by the spring and summer of 1552, Edward VI, though outwardly appearing to have recovered from measles and engaging actively in his royal duties, was likely carrying a profound, hidden vulnerability. His body, which had endured the normal illnesses of childhood and the more recent assault of measles, was perhaps like a fortress whose walls had been breached, whose defenders were depleted, leaving it exposed to future attacks. One quirky, or rather, chillingly ironic detail is that his father, Henry VIII, for all his later corpulence and festering ulcers, had been a man of remarkably robust constitution in his youth, surviving numerous illnesses and accidents. Edward, it seems, did not inherit this same iron resilience. The shocking secret is that the stage for his final, fatal illness was likely set many months before its most dramatic symptoms appeared. The robust, most beautiful boy was now, unbeknownst to most, a youth whose immune system was a ticking time bomb. When the next serious illness struck, as it inevitably would in the unhygienic and disease-ridden environment of 16th century London, his body would have little left with which to fight. This underlying frailty, this compromised defense, is crucial to understanding the horrifying speed and severity of his ultimate decline. A decline that would lead him to that state of rotting alive, promised by our title. The precious jewel was becoming tragically, fatally flawed. The year 1553 dawns, and King Edward VI, now 15 years old, is deeply immersed in the affairs of state, particularly his controversial plans to alter the line of succession and secure a Protestant future for England. He appears, at least to some outward observers, to be a young monarch growing in confidence and authority. But beneath this veneer of royal diligence, a far more sinister process is underway. In February of that year, a seemingly innocuous symptom appears, one that will prove to be the harbinger of his horrific death, a persistent cough. You, the observer, feel the chill as this first, faint note of doom is sounded. Initially, the cough might have been dismissed as a common cold, a trivial winter ailment, especially in the damp, drafty palaces of Tudor England. Edward himself, with his characteristic diligence, likely tried to carry on with his duties, attending council meetings, studying state papers, perhaps even attempting some light exercise if his physicians permitted. But this was no ordinary cough. It lingered, it deepened, it began to rack his young frame with increasing violence. The medical hardship of this period was not just the physical discomfort of the cough itself, but the growing anxiety, the dawning realization, both for Edward and for those around him, that this might be something more serious than a passing illness. As February turns into March, Edward's condition visibly deteriorates. The cough becomes more productive, perhaps bringing up phlegm, maybe even tinged with blood, a classic, ominous sign. He begins to experience fevers, night sweats, and a general debilitating malaise. His appetite wanes, and he starts to lose weight, his youthful frame becoming noticeably thinner. You can imagine the hushed, worried consultations among his physicians. Men like Dr. George Owen and Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had also attended his father, Henry VIII, in his final illness. They would have employed all the diagnostic tools and theories of 16th century medicine, which, as you know, were woefully inadequate by our standards. They might have examined his urine, checked his pulse, and debated the balance of his bodily humors. The diagnosis they eventually arrived at, or at least the one commonly recorded, was a severe defluxion of the lungs, or consumption, terms used at the time for what was most likely a virulent form of pulmonary tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was a common and often fatal disease in this era, highly contagious, and with no effective cure. For a youth whose immune system had already been severely compromised by measles the previous year, as we discussed, contracting such an aggressive lung infection would be a death sentence. The shocking secret is how rapidly this disease, once it took hold, would ravage his already weakened body. One quirky, or rather tragic detail, is that in the early stages of his illness, there were attempts to maintain an outward appearance of normality at court. Official communications might have downplayed the severity of the king's condition, but the rumors would have spread, the whispers in the corridors growing louder with each passing week. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the king's chief minister, would have been acutely aware of the political implications of Edward's failing health, particularly for his own power and for the Protestant succession he and Edward were so desperately trying to secure. The human endurance of Edward, now fighting a losing battle against a devastating internal enemy, while also trying to manage the affairs of a kingdom and dictate its future, is a poignant testament to his strong will, even as his body began its inexorable decline towards that state of rotting alive. The cough that began in February was the opening salvo in his final, terrible battle. The cough that began in February 1553 was merely the overture to a symphony of suffering that would consume King Edward VI. As winter grudgingly gives way to a cold, damp spring, the young king's condition deteriorates with horrifying speed, his body beginning a grotesque and public decay that chillingly earns the descriptor in our title, rotting alive. You, the unwilling witness to this royal agony, are now confronted with the full, unvarnished, gory history of a body surrendering to a relentless, ravaging disease, a medical hardship almost beyond modern comprehension. The initial diagnosis of a severe lung infection, likely tuberculosis, proves tragically accurate, but the symptoms Edward endures, as recorded by contemporary observers and later analyzed by medical historians, paint a picture of systemic collapse. By March and April, his cough is no longer just a persistent irritation. It's violent, racking, bringing up not just phlegm, But as the script notes you provided so vividly state, blood and liquids that were black or green. Imagine the horror of this for the young king, for his attendants. These discolored, foul-smelling effusions, a clear, terrifying sign of the putrefaction occurring within his own lungs. There are no antibiotics, no respiratory therapies, only the useless herbal concoctions and desperate prayers of his physicians. His body, once praised for its beauty, begins to waste away with alarming rapidity. The youthful roundness of his face disappears, replaced by a gaunt, skeletal thinness. His eyes perhaps sink deeper into their sockets, shadowed with pain and exhaustion. But then, in a cruel twist of this horrifying disease process, another, even more grotesque transformation occurs. As his internal organs, particularly his liver and kidneys, begin to fail under the onslaught of infection, and perhaps the toxic effects of some of his medicines, his body starts to swell, not with healthy flesh but with retained fluids, a condition known as edema or dropsy. He becomes, as one contemporary graphically described it, swollen like overripe fruit, his limbs distended, his abdomen bloated. You try to reconcile this image with that of the most precious jewel of England. And then come the sores. As his circulation fails and his tissues become waterlogged and deprived of nutrients, painful, weeping sores, ulcers, or skin lesions begin to appear all over his skin. These would have been agonizing, prone to infection, and would have added to the already considerable stench of sickness and decay that likely permeated his chambers. The human endurance required to bear such constant, multifaceted physical torment, especially for a boy of 15, is almost unimaginable. His royal bed, once a symbol of power and privilege, now becomes a rack of suffering. The scholarly debate sometimes considers whether other opportunistic infections, perhaps even a form of septicemia, blood poisoning, originating from his ravaged lungs or the skin sores, contributed to this rapid systemic breakdown. In an era without germ theory, every touch, every ministration, carried the risk of introducing new pathogens to his already overwhelmed system. One quirky, or rather deeply somber detail, is that despite this horrifying physical disintegration, Edward's mind, by most accounts, remained alarmingly sharp, acutely aware of his own decaying state, and increasingly desperate to secure his Protestant succession before death claimed him. The shocking secret is this terrifying duality, a keen intellect trapped within a body that was, quite literally, putrefying while he still drew breath. This was the reality of rotting alive for the boy king. In the midst of the relentless, horrifying decline of King Edward VI, as his young body is ravaged by disease, becoming swollen and covered in painful sores, a most peculiar and ultimately cruel event occurs in May 1553. For a brief, tantalizing period, the king appears to rally. The shocking secret, or rather, the poignant illusion, is a fleeting semblance of recovery, a moment that brings a desperate, fragile glimmer of hope to a court shrouded in anxiety and political maneuvering, only to be brutally extinguished. You, the observer, witness this false dawn, a cruel trick played by a body already deep in the throes of its final battle. Imagine the scene in early May, after weeks, perhaps months, of agonizing symptoms, the violent cough, the discolored effusions, the wasting followed by grotesque swelling, the weeping sores. There is a sudden, unexpected improvement in the king's condition. Perhaps the fevers subside for a time. The coughing might become less severe. He might even be able to take a little nourishment. or speak with a clearer voice. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief, however cautious, rippling through the inner circle of the court. Was it a miracle? Had the physician's strange concoctions finally worked? Or was it simply the unpredictable ebb and flow of a devastating illness? For John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the king's chief minister and the man desperately trying to engineer a Protestant succession that would exclude Princess Mary, this apparent improvement would have been a moment of intense, if perhaps conflicting, emotions. On one hand, a recovering king might disrupt his carefully laid plans to place his daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne. On the other, a king who lived, even for a little longer, might provide more time to legitimize those plans. The human endurance of Northumberland himself, navigating these treacherous political waters while the king's life hung in the balance, was that of a high-stakes gambler. This period of remission, however, was tragically short-lived. It was the calm before the storm, the deceptive rally that sometimes occurs in the terminal illnesses before the final, irreversible decline. Within days, or perhaps a week or two at most, all the horrifying symptoms returned, often with even greater ferocity. The cough, as the script notes you provided state, came back more violent than ever. The swelling, the sores, the fevers, all resurged, dashing any lingering hopes. You can picture the despair, deeper now, for having been briefly lifted, settling once more over the royal household. The medical hardship for Edward was this cruel seesaw of suffering, a brief respite only making the subsequent plunge into agony even more unbearable. The scholarly debate among medical historians might consider the physiological reasons for such a temporary improvement. Was it a brief period where his young body, with its last reserves of strength, managed to fight back against the infection? Or was it perhaps the effect of some particular and ultimately ineffective treatment that provided momentary symptomatic relief? One quirky yet tragic detail is how such false dawns can impact those around the dying. Hope is a powerful and sometimes dangerous emotion. This brief illusion of recovery at court might have led to a temporary relaxation of the intense political maneuvering, or perhaps even a shift in alliances, only for the grim reality of the king's terminal state to reassert itself with devastating finality. The shocking secret of this fleeting recovery is its cruelty, a brief lifting of the veil of death, only to reveal an even more horrifying certainty. The boy king was not getting better. He was merely gathering himself for the final, terrible descent, while King Edward VI's young body was undergoing a horrifying, relentless process of decay throughout the spring and early summer of 1553. A shocking secret that amazed and perhaps terrified many of his contemporaries was the enduring, even intensified sharpness of his mind. As you, the observer, witness these final months, you see a stark, almost grotesque juxtaposition, a physique literally rotting alive, yet a keen intellect, a formidable will, and a fervent religious conviction that remained undimmed, focused with singular, desperate intensity on one all-consuming goal: securing the Protestant future of England. Imagine the scene in the king's sick chamber. His body is a landscape of medical hardship, swollen, covered in weeping sores, racked by a violent cough that brings up foul matter. He is likely in constant, agonizing pain. Yet, when the fever subsides or his mind clears from the opiates, perhaps administered to dull the agony, he is not a listless, defeated invalid. Instead, he summons his counselors, dictates letters, and engages in complex theological and political discussions. You see him, propped up on pillows, his breathing labored, yet his eyes bright with an almost unnatural fervor as he outlines his plans for the succession. His primary obsession, as we've noted, is to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary from ever inheriting the throne. He genuinely, passionately believes that Mary's accession would mean the undoing of the English Reformation, the return of papal tyranny, and the damnation of his kingdom's soul. This religious conviction, instilled in him from his earliest childhood by his Protestant tutors and reinforced by his own devout studies, now becomes the driving force of his final days. The human endurance he displays is not just in bearing his physical suffering, but in this relentless mental and political effort, even as his life ebbs away. The close, affectionate relationship he once shared with Mary and Elizabeth in their shared childhood nursery has by this point completely deteriorated. A casualty of religious division and political expediency. His exclusion of Mary from the throne is understandable given his Protestant zeal. But why Elizabeth, herself a Protestant? The script notes you provided raise this question. Perhaps, as suggested, it was because Elizabeth, with her own keen intellect and firm grasp of legal principles, would not simply be a pliant placeholder for his preferred Protestant line, or she might not have agreed to so blatantly overturn their father Henry VIII's act of succession. Or perhaps, in his weakened, fevered state, his paranoia extended even to her. The scholarly debate continues on his precise motivations regarding Elizabeth. One quirky yet telling detail is that Edward, even amidst his suffering, continued to write in his personal chronicle, meticulously recording events and his own thoughts. Though the entries become sparser and perhaps more focused as his illness progresses, he also engaged in theological writings and prayers, some of which survive, revealing a mind grappling with both affairs of state and matters of the soul. The shocking secret for those who might have underestimated him, due to his youth or his illness, was this unyielding mental acuity and strength of will. He was not merely a passive victim of his disease or a puppet of his counselors, though Northumberland undoubtedly influenced him. In these final months, Edward VI, the boy king, was determined to be a king indeed, using every last ounce of his fading strength to try and shape the future of his realm, even as his own body was betraying him in the most horrific way imaginable. His sharp mind was his last redoubt, his final weapon in a battle he was ultimately doomed to lose. As King Edward VI's physical form continues its horrifying descent towards an early grave in the spring and summer of 1553, his sharp, fevered mind is consumed by one overriding, desperate ambition: to secure a Protestant succession for England, and by any means necessary, to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary from inheriting the crown. You, the observer, are now witness to the shocking secret of how this dying boy king, with the active encouragement of powerful figures around him, particularly John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, attempted to overturn his own father's will and the established laws of succession in a last-ditch, audacious, and ultimately doomed political gambit. This was his device for the succession. Imagine the scene. Edward, racked with pain, his body swollen and covered in sores, propped up in his bed, dictates his intentions to his counselors or scribes. The medical hardship he endures is relentless, yet his will remains unbroken, his focus laser-sharp on this one critical issue. Henry VIII's third act of succession 1543, and his will, 1546, had clearly stipulated that if Edward died without heirs, the crown should pass first to Mary and her heirs, and then to Elizabeth and her heirs. This was the law of the land. But for Edward, a fervent, almost fanatical Protestant, the prospect of Mary, a devout Catholic, becoming queen was anathema. It meant, in his eyes, the certain reversal of the English Reformation, the return of papal authority, and the persecution of his fellow Protestants. So, with a determination that belied his failing strength, Edward set about drafting his devise. The initial versions of this document, likely influenced by his belief that women were unfit to rule in their own right, a common sentiment at the time, though his own half-sisters were formidable figures, aimed to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth entirely. Instead, the crown was to pass to the male heirs of his Protestant cousins, the Grey family, specifically to the as yet unborn sons of Lady Frances Brandon, Henry VIII's niece, or, failing that, to the sons of Lady Jane Grey, Frances's eldest daughter. You can almost see the young king, with his tutor's lessons on patrilineal succession fresh in his mind, trying to construct a purely Protestant male line. However, as his illness progressed with terrifying speed, and it became clear he would not live long enough for any of these hypothetical male gray hairs to be born and come of age, the devise underwent a crucial and ultimately fatal revision. One quirky, or rather legally dubious detail, is how the wording was altered. The original draft might have said, "To the L, Addie, Jane's heirs male." Edward, in his final weeks, reportedly had this changed to the Lady Jane and her heirs male, with 3 trembling strokes of his pen, or by dictating this change, the dying boy king effectively named Lady Jane Grey, his 16-year-old Protestant cousin, and conveniently for Northumberland, also Northumberland's daughter-in-law, having recently been married to his son, Guildford Dudley, as his direct heir to the throne of England. The scholarly debate rages over how much of this devise was Edward's own deeply held religious conviction, and how much was the cunning manipulation of the Duke of Northumberland, who clearly stood to gain immense power if his daughter-in-law became queen. Most historians agree it was a combination of both. Edward provided the fervent religious justification. Northumberland provided the political ruthlessness, and an heir apparent who was firmly under his control. The shocking secret of my device for the succession is its audacity, its illegality. It directly contravened an act of Parliament and Henry VIII's will, and the sheer, desperate lengths to which a dying boy king and his ambitious minister would go to try and shape the future, even if it meant plunging the kingdom into an unprecedented succession crisis. The human endurance of Edward in these final days, pushing through his agony to complete this document, is a testament to his powerful, if misguided, zeal as King Edward VI lay dying, his young body a canvas of unimaginable suffering, his mind still fiercely battling to secure a Protestant future for England through his devise for the succession. Another powerful figure looms large in the shadowy chambers of Greenwich Palace, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. You, the observer of this grim historical tableau, cannot help but ponder the shocking secret of Dudley's role. Was he merely a loyal servant, dutifully carrying out the wishes of his devout young king? Or was he a master manipulator, cynically exploiting Edward's religious zeal and physical weakness for his own family's aggrandizement? The truth, as is often the case in the gory history of power, is likely a complex and unsettling mixture. John Dudley was an undeniably able and ambitious man. He had risen to prominence after engineering the downfall of the previous Lord Protector Somerset. By 1553, he was the most powerful man in England, the head of Edward's government. He was also a committed Protestant, at least outwardly, and had supported Edward's religious reforms. So, on the surface, his alignment with Edward's desire to exclude the Catholic Mary from the succession seems ideologically consistent. However, the medical hardship of Edward's rapid decline presented Dudley with both a crisis and an unparalleled opportunity. The devise for the succession, as we've seen, ultimately named Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's own daughter-in-law, as Edward's heir. This was no coincidence. In May 1553, just as Edward's health was clearly failing catastrophically, Northumberland had orchestrated a series of dynastic marriages, the most significant being that of his fourth son, Lord Guilford Dudley, to Lady Jane Grey. This move, you can clearly see, positioned his family perfectly to inherit the throne if Edward's devise could be made to stick. Was he prescient, or was he actively shaping events to his advantage? The scholarly debate is intense on this point. Some historians argue that Edward himself was the primary architect of the devise, driven by his own fervent Protestant convictions and a precocious, if somewhat arrogant, belief in his own royal prerogative to determine the succession, even against his father's will and an act of Parliament. In this view, Northumberland merely facilitated the king's wishes, perhaps offering advice and helping to overcome legal and political obstacles. Others, however, paint a darker picture, suggesting that Northumberland, seeing the king weakening daily, subtly or not so subtly, guided Edward's thoughts, playing upon his religious fears and his youthful determination to ensure his reforms outlived him. You can imagine Dudley, with his smooth courtier's tongue, gently reinforcing Edward's anxieties about Mary, and perhaps suggesting Lady Jane Grey as the most suitable, most reliably Protestant alternative. One quirky yet telling detail is the pressure exerted upon judges and counselors to sign and legitimize Edward's devise, even though many recognized its dubious legality. Some reportedly signed under duress, fearing Northumberland's wrath or the dying king's displeasure. This suggests Northumberland was prepared to use strong-arm tactics to achieve his goals. The human endurance of these officials, caught between their legal conscience and the demands of powerful men, must have been considerable. The shocking secret is that even if Edward was a willing participant, the entire scheme had the strong imprint of Northumberland's ambition. He was playing a desperate, high-stakes game, staking his family's entire future on the success of this audacious coup. Whether he was a loyal servant carrying out a dying king's will or a ruthless opportunist, exploiting a national crisis for personal gain, or something in between, John Dudley's shadow falls heavily and ominously across the final agonizing days of Edward VI. Despite the advanced state of his illness, despite his body being a landscape of grotesque decay, as he was, in effect, rotting alive, King Edward VI was compelled, or perhaps himself insisted upon, one final public appearance in the early summer of 1553. This event, you will find, was not a display of royal fortitude, but a horrifying spectacle that sent shivers down the spines of those who witnessed it, confirming the shocking secret of the king's near-terminal condition to a wider, if still select, audience. It was July 1st, 1553. The occasion was the reception of a new French ambassador, Antoine de Noailles, at Greenwich Palace, Such diplomatic events were crucial, and the king's presence, however frail, was deemed necessary to maintain the facade of a functioning government, especially given the delicate political situation surrounding the succession. You can imagine the immense effort involved in preparing the young king for this ordeal. His attendants would have tried their best to dress him in regal attire, to mask the ravages of his illness, perhaps using cosmetics or padding to hide his emaciation, and almost certainly copious amounts of perfume to try and combat the ever-present odor of sickness and decay. The medical hardship of simply getting him ready, of moving his pain-racked, swollen body, would have been considerable, but no amount of Tudor finery or courtly artifice could truly hide the horrifying truth. When Edward was brought forth, likely carried or heavily supported, those present were confronted with a truly ghastly sight. Contemporary accounts, though perhaps tinged with the drama of the moment, describe a figure almost unrecognizable as the once most beautiful boy. He was emaciated, his skin sallow and marked by sores. The painful sores all over his skin from the script notes you provided. His breathing was labored, his voice weak. The human endurance he displayed in even attempting this appearance is a testament to his iron will, or perhaps the desperate pressure from Northumberland to maintain an illusion of royal capability. The French ambassador, a seasoned diplomat, was reportedly deeply shocked by the king's appearance, as were many English courtiers who had not seen him up close for some time. The sight of their young monarch in such a state of advanced physical decay sent a palpable wave of dismay and apprehension through the court. You can almost feel the hushed whispers, the averted gazes, the dawning realization in the eyes of many that the king was not just gravely ill, but actively dying. This public appearance, intended perhaps to project an image of continuity and control, had the opposite effect. It brutally exposed the king's utter frailty and the impending crisis of succession. One quirky, or rather deeply poignant, detail, recorded from around this time, as noted in the text you shared, is Edward whispering to his closest attendant, "I am glad to die." Whether this was a moment of genuine spiritual resignation, a release from unbearable suffering, or simply the rambling of a fevered mind, it's a heartbreaking utterance from a boy of 15 who had borne the weight of a kingdom and the agony of a horrific illness. The shocking secret revealed by this final, terrible public appearance was that the carefully constructed dam of secrecy around the king's true condition had finally burst. The sight of their dying king, a living specter, confirmed to all who saw him that England was on the precipice of an unknown and potentially very dangerous future. The end was no longer a matter of if, but when, and likely, very, very soon. The horrifying public appearance of King Edward VI on July 1st, 1553, had laid bare the grim reality of his condition. The end was now undeniably imminent. In the days that followed, you, the observer, are confined to the hushed, tense atmosphere of Greenwich Palace, where the boy king's life is rapidly, agonizingly ebbing away. The shocking secret now is not that he is dying, but the desperate attempts to control the narrative of his death and to manage its political fallout, even as his body surrenders to its final medical hardship. His physical suffering in these last few days must have been extreme. The rotting alive descriptor from our title becomes a brutal reality. His breathing, already labored, would have grown shallower, more ragged. The sores covering his swollen body would have been a constant source of agony. He was likely slipping in and out of consciousness, perhaps racked by fevers and delirium. You can imagine his physicians, powerless, resorting to prayers and perhaps palliative measures, like offering sips of water or wine, their faces grim with the knowledge that their art had failed. The human endurance of those tending to him, witnessing this slow, grotesque decay of a young life, particularly one upon whom so many hopes had rested, would have been tested to its limits. Then, on the evening of July 6th, 1553, at Greenwich Palace, King Edward VI, just 15 years old, finally succumbed to his devastating illness. His reign had lasted a mere 6.5 years. According to some accounts, particularly those favorable to his Protestant piety, his last moments were spent in prayer. The script notes you provided mention that his last words were a prayer in English that he composed himself, a testament to his enduring faith, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. It was, in its own way, a death full of pain and secrecy. The secrecy was paramount. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and his allies on the Privy Council knew that the king's death, if announced prematurely, could unravel their carefully constructed and legally dubious plan to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. Therefore, a shocking secret protocol was immediately enacted. Edward's death was concealed, even from his own half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, for several days. You can picture the palace in a state of lockdown, guards posted, access restricted, while Northumberland and his faction scrambled to consolidate their position, to summon Lady Jane Grey, and to prepare for her proclamation as Queen. This period of a hidden death is a quirky, if macabre, feature of Tudor royal transitions, where political necessity often overrode personal grief or even basic decorum. The scholarly debate often considers the legality and morality of these actions. Was Northumberland acting to preserve the Protestant Reformation, as he claimed, or was he simply making a desperate bid for power through his daughter-in-law? The truth, as usual, is likely a complex mix. What is clear is that the death of this boy king, this most precious jewel, who had carried such immense expectations, was not an occasion for open national mourning, but a clandestine event, a closely guarded secret, its announcement delayed until the political stage could be set for the next, and ultimately tragic act in England's unfolding dynastic drama. The final breath of Edward VI, drawn in pain and secrecy, was not an end, but the beginning of a new and dangerous crisis for the Tudor realm. King Edward VI is dead. His passing on July 6th, 1553, kept a closely guarded secret by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and his allies. Their audacious plan, enshrined in Edward's device for the succession, is now set in motion to bypass Henry VIII's legitimate daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and proclaim Northumberland's own daughter-in-law, the 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey, as Queen of England. You, the observer, are now witness to the immediate, chaotic, and ultimately tragic aftermath of Edward's death. A shocking secret power grab that would unravel with astonishing speed, leading to more gory history on the executioner's block. For a few days, the secret of Edward's death holds. Northumberland uses this time to consolidate his forces in London, to secure the Tower, and to summon Lady Jane Grey, who is reportedly reluctant and overwhelmed by the prospect of becoming queen. On July 10th, 4 days after Edward's actual death, Jane is formally proclaimed queen in London. You can imagine the scene, a forced, somewhat hollow hollow display of royal pageantry with little genuine popular enthusiasm. Most of England, while perhaps apprehensive about the prospect of the Catholic Mary Tudor ascending the throne, still viewed her as Henry VIII's rightful heir according to his will and Act of Parliament. Lady Jane Grey, for all her Protestant piety and royal blood, she was Henry VIII's grandniece, was seen by many as a usurper, a puppet of the deeply unpopular Duke of Northumberland. The human endurance of Lady Jane Grey during this period is a poignant side story. A young, intelligent, and devoutly Protestant girl, she was thrust onto the throne against her better judgment, a pawn in the ambitions of older, powerful men. Her reign would last a mere 9 days, earning her the tragic epithet, the 9-Day Queen. Meanwhile, Princess Mary, having been alerted to Edward's death and Northumberland's plans, some say through secret messages from supporters at court, did not passively await her fate. Displaying a surprising degree of courage and political acumen, she fled to East Anglia, a region with strong Catholic sympathies, and began to rally support. The shocking secret for Northumberland was how quickly and overwhelmingly the country, from commoners to nobility, flocked to Mary's standard. They saw her not just as a Catholic, but as the legitimate Tudor heir, the true daughter of Henry VIII, wronged by an overreaching and despised minister. You can almost feel the tide turning against Northumberland. His support in London and on the Privy Council begins to evaporate as Mary's forces grow. By July 19th, the game was up. The Privy Council in London, sensing the shift in power and fearing for their own necks, abandoned Northumberland and proclaimed Mary as queen. Northumberland's forces deserted him. He was arrested and brought back to London as a traitor. Lady Jane Grey and her young husband, Guilford Dudley, were imprisoned in the Tower of London. The medical hardship here is the swift, brutal reality of political failure in Tudor England. One quirky detail: upon hearing of Mary's proclamation, Northumberland himself reportedly tried to save his skin by publicly proclaiming Mary as queen in Cambridge, a desperate, futile gesture. Queen Mary, I entered London in triumph on August 3rd, 1553. Her path to the throne had been secured not by Edward's will, but by her own determination and the overwhelming support of the English people, who desired a true Tudor monarch. The gory history would soon follow. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, was swiftly tried and executed for treason in August. Lady Jane Grey and Guilford Dudley, though initially spared, remained prisoners. After a Protestant rebellion in early 1554, Wyatt's Rebellion, Mary, fearing Jane as a continued focus for Protestant plots, reluctantly signed her death warrant. Lady Jane Grey, the intelligent, tragic 9-Day Queen, was beheaded on Tower Hill in February 1554. Another young victim of the brutal power struggles that followed Edward VI's horrific death. Edward's desperate last-ditch effort to control the succession had failed utterly, paving the way instead for the Catholic restoration he so dreaded. The brief, tumultuous, and ultimately tragic reign of King Edward VI, cut short by his horrific death at the tender age of 15, leaves behind a complex and unsettling legacy. You, the observer, having journeyed through his shielded childhood, his chilling detachment, his fervent religious zeal, his grotesque physical decay, and the chaotic aftermath of his failed succession plan, are left to ponder a final, shocking secret. Did England, in fact, dodge a bullet? When this boy king, this Henry VIII in the making, died so young, was his early demise, however agonizing for him personally, a perverse blessing for the future of the realm. History often portrays Edward VI as a pitiable figure, a frail, scholarly boy manipulated by powerful men, his reign a mere Protestant interlude between the colossal figures of his father, Henry VIII, and his half-sister Elizabeth I. There is truth in this image of vulnerability, especially concerning his medical hardships and the political machinations that surrounded him. But the script you provided earlier, and our exploration, has unveiled a darker, more complex, and potentially far more dangerous side to this young monarch. The evidence of his malicious temper, his cold detachment from suffering, even that of his own executed uncles, his apparent thrill at the massacre of rebels, and that truly gory history detail of him tearing a living Vulcan into 4 pieces with his bare hands in a fit of rage. These paint a picture of a youth with a disturbing capacity for cruelty and a chilling lack of empathy. Consider his vision for England. Had he lived to adulthood and fully implemented his will, it would have been, as the script notes suggest, a radically different nation. He envisioned a heavily militarized state, with a massive standing army and an efficient network of fortifications. His economic plans, though perhaps advanced for their time in their focus on central control and planned investment, also hinted at an autocratic, top-down approach. Most significantly, his religious vision was one of extreme, uncompromising Puritanism, a faith to be strictly enforced, intolerant of any dissent, whether from Catholics or even more moderate forms of Protestantism. You can imagine a Tudor England under a mature Edward VI becoming a stark, austere, and perhaps brutally repressive, covenanted cité, more akin to Calvin's Geneva or later Puritan regimes than the more pragmatic, if still often harsh, England of his father or sister Elizabeth. The human endurance of those living under such a regime would have been severely tested. Religious persecution, already a feature of his short reign, though often driven by his counselors, would likely have intensified. The arts, music, and popular festivities that characterized earlier Tudor England might have been suppressed under a wave of Puritan austerity. The scholarly debate is active here. Would Edward have matured into a more moderate ruler, or would his youthful zealotry, his coldness, and his apparent ruthlessness have solidified into a truly terrifying tyranny? One quirky, yet profound irony is that his desperate attempt to secure a Protestant succession by excluding Mary actually backfired spectacularly, leading directly to Mary's accession and her subsequent bloody attempts to restore Catholicism, earning her the epithet Bloody Mary. If Edward had allowed his father's will to stand, the transition might have been different, though likely still fraught. The shocking secret, when all is said and done, is that the death of this angel-faced boy king, however physically horrific for him, may have spared England an even greater, more prolonged period of internal strife, religious persecution, and autocratic rule. His horrific death was a personal tragedy, but perhaps in the grand, brutal sweep of history, a grimly fortunate event for the future of the nation. As you let these unsettling thoughts settle, and the story of Edward VI fades into the quiet of the night, ponder the strange, often cruel twists of fate that shape the destinies of kings and kingdoms.